Officer Daniels thought he was untouchable. He had bullied, harassed, and abused his power for years, especially against black people. So when he saw a black woman in court, he didn't hesitate. He grabbed her, pushed her, humiliated her in front of the judge. In front of witnesses, he made sure she knew who was in charge. But then she reached into her jacket, pulled out a badge. The courtroom fell silent. Daniel staggered back, his face turning pale, because this wasn't just any black woman. The truth frees everyone in the court. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the judge prepared to give the final ruling. Officer Daniel stood with his usual smug arrogance, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He had done this dozens of times before, testified against people he had arrested, many of whom had the misfortune of being black in a city where cops like him thrive on unchecked power. Today was no different, or so he thought. In the back of the courtroom, the doors swung open. A woman in a sleek black suit stepped in. Moving with quiet authority, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew her presence alone demanded respect. She took a seat in the gallery, her sharp eyes locked onto Daniels as he continued to spew his testimony. Daniels noticed her almost immediately, his gaze flickered with a mix of annoyance and condescension. Ishan, another black woman. Probably someone's relative hoping for a miracle. He smirked, turning back to the judge. Then she stood up. Daniels stiffened, narrowing his eyes. She wasn't just any courtroom observer. There was something about her, the way she held herself. He didn't like it. "Sit down, lady," he barked, taking a few steps toward her. "This isn't your business." The woman met his glare, unmoved. "Excuse me?" Daniel scoffed. He enjoyed these moments, making sure people like her knew their place. He moved closer, his voice dropping to a sneer. "You lost this, ain't the welfare office." A hush fell over the room. The judge's gavel hovered. Mid-air shock plastered across his face. A few people gasped audibly. The woman, however, remained completely still, her dark eyes piercing and unreadable. Never wavered. "Remove your hand," she said, her voice controlled but with an unmistakable steel edge. Daniel grip tightened around her arm. "Or what?" he spat. Giving her a slight shove, the power trip surged through him. He could already imagine her flustered response, the way she'd shrink away like so many others had. But she didn't. She simply reached into her jacket. Daniel's instincts flared, his muscles tensed as he prepared to react. He knew this move. Someone reaching into their pocket, a sudden motion he had drawn his gun for. Lest the entire room held its breath. She pulled out a badge. The air in the courtroom turned to ice. Daniels's smug grin evaporated his face, drained of color, his fingers slipping from her arm as he staggered back a step. The badge gleamed under the overhead lights, but not just any badge. She lifted her chin slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. "Officer Daniels, I am Chief Renee Carter," she announced, her words slicing through the silence like a blade. "And as of this morning, I am your new boss." The courtroom erupted. Daniels stood frozen in place, his lips parting, but no words came out. The weight of his actions, his arrogance, his unchecked power, came crashing down on him all at once. The judge's gavel finally came down, but it was drowned out by the whispers, the murmurs. The stunned realization that the world as Daniels knew it had just changed forever. A heavy silence hung over the courtroom. Officer Daniels' breath hitched, his mind scrambling to process what had just happened. His world, his unchecked power, had been built on the belief that people like her, black, composed, untouchable, didn't exist. His chief, Renee Carter, stood tall, her badge still gleaming in the fluorescent light. Daniel's fingers twitched at his sides, his face contorting as he fought to regain control. The judge tapped his gavel. "Order in the court," he commanded, but even he couldn't mask the intrigue simmering beneath his voice. Renee turned to him. "Your Honor, I request a private discussion regarding Officer Daniels' conduct, both today and in his career. I believe it will be relevant to these proceedings." The judge hesitated, studying her. Daniels could practically feel the shift in the room. The power he wielded was slipping through his fingers very well. Chief Carter, the judge, finally said, "WEC recess for 15 minutes." Daniels felt the air leave his lungs. The judge actually listened to her as people began filing out of the courtroom. Renee turned, locking eyes with him. The intensity in her gaze made him feel smaller than he had in his entire career. Flashback Renee's journey. Renee Carter hadn't always worn a badge, born and raised in the very city that had failed so many. She had seen firsthand how the system worked against people who looked like her. Her father, a local pastor, had always preached justice, but he also knew that justice was rare for black families in their neighborhood. At 16, Renee watched as her older brother was pulled over for matching a description. She had stood frozen, clutching their mother's hand, as officers dragged him from his car, slammed him against the hood, and threw him in cuffs. He hadn't done anything wrong, but that hadn't mattered. That night had shaped her. She knew then that the only way to fight a corrupt system was to get inside it, to change it. Despite every obstacle, racism in the academy, white officers doubting her authority, superiors questioning her decisions. She had climbed the ranks, and now she was here, the first black female police chief in the city's history, and her first order of business, cleaning out the rot back in the courtroom. Daniels paced the empty aisle, his pulse hammering in his throat. He needed to fix this. He had connections, people who had protected him for years. He grabbed his phone quickly. Dialing, "Yeah, it's me," he whispered when the line picked up. "We have a problem." Renee stood in a private room with the judge and the defense attorney. "Your Honor," she said, placing a thick folder on the table. "Before we continue Jamal's case, I want you to see something." The judge opened it. Inside were records, complaints, lawsuits, excessive force reports, all with one name attached. Officer Daniels. The judge's face darkened. "Why haven't I seen this before?" "Because Daniels was protected," Renee answered simply, but not anymore. A knock at the door. An officer stepped in his face. "Uneasy, Chief Carter, you might want to see this." Renee followed him into the hallway outside the courthouse. Reporters were already gathering. And at the center of it all, Daniels, flanked by a lawyer and a few high-ranking officers, was speaking into a microphone. "This is a political hit job," he declared. "I have done nothing wrong. I am being targeted because I uphold the law." Renee clenched her jaw. He was going to fight this, but that was fine because she was ready. Renee stood at the courthouse entrance, watching the media circus unfold. Officer Daniels was already spinning his narrative, playing the victim, framing himself as a dedicated cop under attack. "This is what happens when you do your job," Daniels said, shaking his head in feigned frustration. "I've spent years protecting this city, putting criminals behind bars, and now because of political games, my career is being destroyed." Renee's fists clenched at her sides. She had seen it before, how men like him twisted reality to turn themselves into martyrs, but this time she wouldn't let the truth be buried inside the courthouse. The real battle begins as Renee re-entered the courtroom. Her phone vibrated. A message from Internal Affairs. "Be careful, Daniel still has people protecting him." She sighed, already knowing this wouldn't be an easy fight, but she had prepared for this moment for years. The judge called the session back into order, his gaze flicking between Daniels and Renee. "Chief Carter, I've reviewed the documents you provided," he said. "These are serious allegations." Daniels leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, his confidence returning. "Allegations, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "Nothing proven, and let's be honest. The chief here seems to have a personal vendetta against me." Renee stepped forward. "It's not personal, Officer Daniels. It's justice." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I request that all of Officer Daniels' previous excessive force cases be reopened, starting with the case of Jamal Brown." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Daniel's jaw tightened. The judge nodded. "I will take that into consideration, but I must warn you, Chief Carter, reopening these cases will be an uphill battle." Renee's expression remained firm. "I understand, Your Honor, but it's a battle worth fighting." Daniels strikes back. Daniels stormed out of the courthouse, His hands bowled into fists. He could feel his power slipping away, and he would not let that happen. Find me something on her. He barked into his phone as he walked. Anything. I don't care if you have to dig up her kindergarten report card. A voice on the other end hesitated. Danny's, you don't get it. This isn't just some political stunt. Carter's got evidence, real evidence. Daniels sneered. Then we make sure no one sees it. That night, a masked figure broke into the police department's internal evidence room. Files were pulled, computers wiped by morning. The case against Daniels was thinner, but Renee had anticipated this when she arrived at the station. She found her office-ransacked papers scattered, a warning message on her desk. Back off, she picked up the paper, reading it slowly, then she smiled. Daniels had just made a fatal mistake. She turned to her assistant. Get me a warrant, I know exactly where to look. The morning air was thick with tension as Renee stood outside the courthouse, her fingers wrapped around a fresh warrant. The break-in at the department's evidence room had been a desperate move. Daniels was panicking, and when men like him panicked, they got sloppy. Her gut told her that Daniels had an insurance policy, a place where he kept the real dirt hidden, and she knew exactly where to look. A hidden case resurfaces. Renee and her team arrived at Daniels' off-duty storage unit, an unassuming metal door. Daniel sat frozen in his car parked in an empty lot on the outskirts of town. His phone buzzed non-stop with messages from fellow officers, his superiors, and the union. Some were telling him to lay low, others were cutting ties entirely. He clenched his jaw, gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. They were abandoning him. The very system that had protected him for so long was turning its back on him, and then the final blow his lawyer called Daniels. The voice on the other end said, hesitant. The department is moving to suspend you indefinitely without pay. Daniel's stomach twisted. They can't do that. He hissed, I have connections, I have leverage. The lawyer hesitated. They're saying they have the video of Marcus Avery. They're saying it's indisputable. Daniel slammed his fist against the dashboard, his breaths coming in short. Ragged gasps. This wasn't happening. He needed a way out. Desperation breathes recklessness. Daniel stormed into his last stronghold, the police union office. He burst through the doors, demanding support. You can't just throw me to the wolves, he spat. I did what I had to do. The streets are safer because of me, but the men inside, the same ones who once laughed at his racist jokes and covered for his brutality, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, an older officer, cleared his throat. Daniels, you need to get out in front of this. Deny it, say the footage was edited. Say, are you serious? Daniels cut in, his voice cracking. You think a fake video is going to hold up? Carter has the public eating out of her damn hands. If we don't shut this down now, we're all next. Another officer shook his head. No, you're next. We're not risking our careers for you. Daniel's blood ran cold. They were done protecting him for the first time in his life. He felt what it was like to be powerless. Renee pushes harder. Renee wasn't done that night. She issued an official warrant for Daniels' arrest as officers arrived at his house banging on the door. Daniels was already gone. He had disappeared. A full-blown manhunt was now underway. Renee's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number popped up. You think you've won, this isn't over. She smirked, locking her phone. Oh, but it was only just beginning. The city was on high alert. News stations ran breaking reports, fugitive cop on the run after murder. Cover-up exposed helicopters hovered above as officers combed the streets. Every highway checkpoint, every airport, every bus station was being monitored. Daniels had nowhere to go, but Renee knew him. She knew exactly where he'd run a man. With nothing to lose, Daniel's world had collapsed in a matter of hours. The system he trusted had discarded him. The same powerful friends who had covered for him now refused to return his calls. His hands trembled as he gripped the stolen car's steering wheel, sweat rolling down his face, his career, his reputation, his entire life gone. But there was one thing left. Revenge. The trap is set. Renee stood outside an abandoned warehouse near the docks. She had anticipated this moment. Daniels was too arrogant to run forever. He wouldn't go out quietly. Her phone rang. "I know you're looking for me." "Carter." "Daniel." Voice rasped through the speaker, "But you don't know how this ends." Renee didn't blink. "I do actually. It ends with you in cuffs." A cruel chuckle. "You think you've won? You think bringing me down changes anything? The system made me, and when I'm gone, someone just like me will take my place." Renee's jaw tightened. "No, Daniels, the system let you exist, but change starts today." A rustling sound, then the line went dead. She exhaled slowly. He was close. The final showdown inside the warehouse. Daniels crouched behind a stack of crates, his stolen service weapon clutched in his hands. He could hear footsteps. Renee had come alone. "Good." She stepped into the dimly lit space, her silhouette sharp, unwavering. "Daniels, it's over." "Danielk." Voice was low, shaking with rage. "You ruined my life." Renee shook her head. "No, you did that." A tense silence. Then Daniels lunged from the shadows, gun raised. Bang. A single gunshot echoed through the warehouse. Daniels staggered back, his gun clattering to the floor. A red stain spread across his shoulder. His breathing turned ragged as he collapsed against a crate. Renee's gun remained steady in her hands. "I told you it was over." Police sirens wailed outside. Officers flooded in, surrounding Daniels as he slumped to his knees. For the first time, he had no power, no control. One of the arresting officers read him his rights, the same words Daniels had coldly recited to countless innocent men before. As they dragged him away, Daniels lifted his head, locking eyes with Renee. One last time, pure hatred, but beneath it, fear, and for Renee, victory, but not just for her. For every victim Daniels thought would never get. Justice Daniels sat in the cold interrogation room, his once pristine uniform replaced with an orange jumpsuit. His hands, now cuffed, twitched against the metal table. He had spent his entire career terrorizing others in rooms just like this. But now he was the one waiting. The door creaked open. Chief Renee Carter stepped in, her presence as commanding as ever. She placed a file on the table and pulled up a chair across from him. She didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Daniel scoffed, forcing a smirk. "Enjoying your little victory?" Renee remained silent. Opening the file, inside were pages of complaints, testimonies, and names of victims whose voices had been ignored for years. "You're facing multiple charges," she said, flipping a page. "Evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, and most importantly, the murder of Marcus Avery." Daniel's jaw clenched at the name. Renee continued, "The DA is offering a deal. Plead guilty. Give up the names of your enablers, the ones who covered for you, and you might avoid life in prison." Daniels let out a bitter laugh. "You really think I'd sell out my own?" Renee leaned in, her voice dropping just slightly. "Your own abandoned you the second you became a liability." Daniel's smirk faltered. She was right, the union. His fellow officers, his connections. They had all turned their backs on him for the first time. He was alone. The courtroom, the final reckoning. Weeks later, the courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the back. Citizens and activists filled the seats, and in the center of it all, Daniels standing trial for his crimes. The prosecution laid out the case with brutal efficiency. The body cam footage, the testimonies, the forged reports. There was no escape. Jamal Brown, the young man Daniels had falsely arrested in the very beginning, took the stand. His voice was steady. "This man treated me like I was nothing." Jamal said, "But today I'm here to make sure no one else suffers like I did." Renee watched from the front row, her hands clasped. This was justice, not revenge. Justice. When the guilty verdict was read, a wave of emotion rippled through the room. Daniels had finally fallen. The aftermath. A system begins to change. Daniels was sentenced to 25 years without parole. His fall sparked a wave of reform in the department. Other officers resigned. Investigations into corruption intensified. And for the first time in years, people believed in change. Renee stood outside the courthouse. Breathing in the crisp air, reporters shouted questions, but she ignored them. Instead, she turned to Jamal standing beside his mother. "You did good today," she said. Jamal nodded. "So did you?" She smiled. This was just the beginning. The sun hung low in the sky as Renee stepped away from the courthouse. The weight of the trial finally lifting. The fight had been long, the scars deep. But today justice had prevailed. Daniels was gone, not just from the force, but from the system that had shielded him for years. No more cover-ups, no more lies. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved in her direction. "Chief Carter, how does it feel to bring down Officer Daniels?" One asked. Renee paused. She could have said it felt good, she could have talked about victory, but instead she looked straight into the camera. This was never about bringing down one man. She said firmly, it was about holding a system accountable, a system that let him exist. The cameras flashed, the world listening. She turned, walking down the steps past the people who had fought alongside her, past Jamal and his family, past the young black kids who now saw a new future, one where justice wasn't just a promise but a reality. As she reached her car, her phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. "One down, many more to go." Renee exhaled. The fight wasn't over, but change had begun, and this was just the first domino to fall.